Hello, welcome you all on Young Scholars IES Academy. In this video, we are going to discuss about the institutional economics. As we know that economics deals with the principle of macroeconomics and microeconomics, in which we learn about consumers utility maximization, producers profit maximization. In the profit maximization process, how the producers reach the highest possible point and how they allocate workers and machines in an optimal way. In this idealized working economy, consumers are rational, means they all information getting related to the quality of the product through prices and set themselves in different market structures. No one paid attention how the transactions are coordinated or what costs are involved in concluding transactions. In economic analysis, consumer pay amounts of money to the seller as per his or her willingness for the ownership of a particular product. Supply and demand coincides. Institutional economics concentrated on the analysis between individuals. Other persons' interest restrict one person's interest. When persons and their interests are dependent on each other, we say that there exists an economic independence between those persons. In the world of scarcity, interest between persons may conflict. If we are many wanting to have the only sandwich available and I get the sandwich, the others remains hungry. According to what rule the conflict about the ownership of the sandwich will be decided. Who is most hungry? Who saw it first? Who pays most? Or will the sandwich be divided among parties? How large portion to each? From all the rules, one rule must be chosen or there will be a fight and sandwich goes to the strongest. How can the rules be chosen? Some might suggest the democratic way or the voting. The market solution could be the willingness to pay. The person who saw it first might argue that the ownership relations was already established before the other comes to the place. The hungriest person may have a point in saying that the increase of his or her energy level might increase most the entire group's efficiency. Some in the group may also get together and try to solve the conflict by cooperation. The cooperation might concern the introduction of a rule where some actors may give up some of the benefits in order to get something. Rules of solving problems caused by economic interdependence are called institutions. Institutional economic analysis means those rules, institutions, and try to modify existing institutions or introduce new ones for better reaching the wanted outcomes. What is the institutional economics? Institutional economics focus on transactions in the economy and how these transactions are coordinated, how different institutions reduce those costs. Because these transaction costs rise to the creation and evaluation of institutions that make the coordination of transactions less costly. Broadly speaking, institutions are rules that facilitate transactions. Institutions are meant to facilitate transactions and improve efficiency, but sometimes it fails to succeed in doing so because people seek to maintain and control institutions to drive their specific private benefits for them, which lead to institution failure to facilitate transactions that welfare enhancing to society at large. Sometimes institutions prove to be ineffective when individuals show opportunistic behavior, and evade the rules successfully. Now, what is the transaction? When commodities are physically transferred in an economic system, it is called exchange. The institutional meaning is the legal transfer of ownership, which is called a transaction. For example, if I own an apple, I can either eat it, save it for the future, sell it, or give it away. By selling and giving it away, I give up from the property right and transfer it to the somebody else who is then in the position to eat it or, for example, to sell it further. The apple may be untouched on the table during the entire process. Only property right relations have changed. Transactions is a central concept in institutional economics. Thus, the ultimate unit of activity, which correlate law, economics, and ethics, must contain in itself the three principles of conflict, dependence, and order. The unit is a transaction. A transaction with its participants is the smallest unit of institutional economics, as stated by Commons in 1990. The transactions changes in the property right take place between individuals or groups of the individuals. A property right is not something a person has independent of the relationship of that person to others. The reason for examining transaction is that transactions shift of property rights occur within the rules set for the transactions. However, by changing rules, the distribution of property right can be affected. It is a matter of the public choice which one of the transaction mode is chosen as a form of the transferring the property right. Property right in turn define who gets what and who pays. Thus, by affecting transactions, the performance of the system can also be affected. A central concept of institutional economics is transactions. Several definitions of the transaction exist in the literature, and the following descriptions summarize the most important features that transaction comprise a legal transfer of ownership and therefore includes an exchange of rights and duties which have been determined by the transaction parties or societies involved. Transactions are not just the exchange of commodities but the alienations and acquisitions between individuals of the rights of the property and liberty created by society, which must therefore be negotiated between the parties concerned before labor can produce or consumers can consume or the commodities can be physically exchanged. Now, what are the types of the transactions? There are the four types of the transactions as per their reasons, and particular institutions are dealing with these type of the transactions. First one is the market transactions and the bargaining transactions. The market transactions, the most common type of the transactions in the market, which takes place in the market between individual buyer and sellers, resulting in a voluntary transfer of property to customers and the transfer of money to the suppliers. The market transaction takes place when the customers and the suppliers exchange the goods and money with each other. The reason for bargaining is scarcity. The price acting as a means. Both parties, the buyers and the sellers, have, at least in principle, an equal legal status with respect to the transactions. Market transactions, also referred to as the bargaining transactions, concern the exchange of ownership between the actors who are legal equals. However, legal equality is compatible with economic inequality. Bargaining powers determines what the price will be. The second type of the transaction is the managerial transactions. Managerial transaction is characterized by the relationship between a legal superior and a legal inferior within an organization. Managerial transactions takes place in the hierarchy. For example, when a good is moved from one department to another in an organization. Somebody has given an authority to command or persuade such a transactions. This type of a transaction is between one person in control, that may be manager, employer or the master, and the one being managed or ordered, that may be employee. The reason for the managerial transaction is not scarcity but efficiency caused by the division of labor. The third type of the transaction is the political transaction. This is also called the rationing transactions. These transactions differ from bargaining and managerial transactions in that they are negotiations of reaching an agreement among several participants who have the authority to apportion benefits and burdens to members of a joint enterprise. This is a type of a transaction that is prevailing in political decision making where citizens and their representatives attempt to reach a political agreement. The political transaction is agreed on by decision makers who have the legal authority to determine how wealth in society should be distributed. When a country produces goods and services, then all kind of laws, regulations or organizations decide about how the cost and benefits of the national wealth are distributed among the members of the society. The last, it can be that the distribution of property rights determine the distribution of wealth. But it can also very well be that a collective decision is taken in society to distribute wealth through taxes and social allowance. Political transactions are about the rules that distribute cost and benefits. Clearly, those transactions are decided by government, but it could also be a private consultative body such as an employer association and trade unions that jointly settles on the terms of employment. Think about minimum wages or working hours, for example. In this context, the long term rationing transaction is also used. The last type of the transaction is the grant or the status transactions. It is a one-sided transactions where the owner of the good gives up the property right without any compensation. This kind of transactions may be based on the friendship or status, the reason being just a habit or the sign of altruism. Grant or status transactions are common between the friends and relatives. For instance, between family members, most transactions in tribal societies base their transactions on status and grants. Now, the foundations of institutional economics. Foundation of the institutional economics were laid in the middle of 19th century. This is also called the German historical school. The followers of German school of thought A are Commons, Pigou, Veblen, Parsons made an observations that were difficult to combine at the same time developing classical economic theory. Among such observations were, as the Veblen stated, that the concept of intangible property, the ownership of expected opportunity, the right to fix prices while withholding the property from others they need but not own. As the Commons and Marx stated, the ownership and materials is not the same thing, and the organizations and institutional structures matter. From the analysis of wealth, ownership, and institutions developed a heterogeneous body of analytical approaches, later known the School of Institutional Economics. If we compare the old versus new institutional economic thought, what is the old? Who follow the old institutional economics goes beyond the new classical economics in investigating the basic structure of property right in the society. It analyzes whose costs are taken into account in the economic calculus and what market measures can be considered as efficient outcomes. For example, what is the relation between efficiency and social acceptance? The market may produce multiple efficient outcomes and thus must decide what kind of a state of a market is preferable. Property rights or say institutional settings determines what is counted as efficiency. The role of power is very important in old institutional economics. If we consider the new institutional economics, which has the rooted in new classical economics, new institutional economic has broadened the traditional economic theory by admitting the observations already by Marx that institutions matter. The other difference to new classical economic concern the assumptions about human behavior. Most new institutional economic approaches recognize bounded rationality, means difficult to process the available information, instead of full rationality and opportuni- opportunism instead of full honesty. New institutional economics believes that institutions arise as part of society's effort to use scarce resources efficiently. New institutional economic scholars have been widely recognized during the last half if 20th century. Representatives of new institutional economics have, among others, got 4 Nobel Prize in economics that are G.M. Buchanan, Simon, Ronald Coase, Douglas C. North. Now, what is the difference in old and new institutional economics? The difference in those schools may be described as follows. In the traditional neoclassical economic theory, the purpose is the cost minimization within a given framework. In the new institutional economic, the cost minimization and economic efficiency can be affected by changing institutions. New institutional economic has relatively little emphasis on power, determining the performance of property right, determining whose costs are taken into account in the analysis. As in old institutional economics, they gave more importance to the power. They said that power is a more important. But under the new institutional economics, they gave more importance to the performance of property rights. Old institutional economic recognized the questions about whose costs are taken into account. It also examined efficiency but asked that whose efficiency is attempted to foster and at cost of whom. So when the new institutional economic examined relations between the master and the subordinate, the old institutional economics may present a question why somebody is the master and the other a subordinate in the first place. Thank you.